if you were to ask the Dark Knight himself with his hard and fast no-killing rule, he'd say absolutely not. Actually, in fact, he would say, absolutely not. When you think about it, dude is pretty Kantian in his ethics. Regardless of what Joker does, there are some lines that good people do not cross. And for Batman, killing definitely falls on the wrong side of that line. But let's be real here. Joker is never gonna stop killing. Sure, Batman will have him thrown back in Arkham, but we all know that he's gonna get out. He always gets out, and once he's free, he will kill again, and maim, and terrorize. And when he does, won't a little bit of that be Batman's fault? Batman has been in a position to kill the Joker hundreds of times. He has had the power to save anyone from ever being a victim of the Joker again. If you have the ability to stop a killer and you don't, are you morally pure because you didn't kill? Or are you morally dirty because you refused to do what needs to be done? So, why do I describe Batman as Kantian? Well, the school of thought laid out by 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, now known as Kantianism, is pretty straightforward. More precisely, it's absolute. Kantianism is all about sticking to the moral rule book. There are never any exceptions or any excuses for violating moral rules. And our man Batman tries his hardest to stick to his code, no matter what. But there are other ways of looking at ethics, like instead of focusing on the intent behind our behavior, what if we paid more attention to the consequences? One moral theory that does this is utilitarianism. It focuses on the results or consequences of our actions and treats intentions as irrelevant. Good consequences equal good actions in this view. So what's a good consequence? Modern utilitarianism was founded in the 18th century by British philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, but the theory has philosophical ancestors in ancient Greek thinkers such as Epicurus. All of these guys agreed that actions should be measured in terms of the happiness or pleasure that they produce. After all, they argued happiness is our final end. It's what we do everything else for. Think about it like this. Many things that you do for the sake of something else. You study to get a good grade, you work to get money. But why do you want good grades or money? There are different answers we could give, like maybe we're seeking affirmation for our intelligence or the approval of our parents or a degree that will give us a career that we want. But why do we want that particular career? Why do we want approval? We can keep asking these questions, but ultimately our answer will bottom out in, I want what I want because I think it will make me happy. That's what we all want. It's one of the few things everyone has in common. And utilitarians believe that's what should drive our morality. Like Kant, utilitarians agree that a moral theory should apply equally to everyone, but they thought the way to do that was to ground it in something that's really intuitive. And there's really nothing more basic than the primal desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So it's often said that utilitarianism is a hedonistic moral theory. This means the good is equal to the pleasant, and we ought morally to pursue pleasure and happiness and work to avoid pain. But utilitarianism is not what you'd call an egoistic theory. Egoism says that everyone ought morally to pursue their own good. In contrast to that, utilitarianism is other-regarding. It says that we should pursue pleasure or happiness not just for ourselves, but for as many sentient beings as possible. To put it formally, we should act always so as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. This is known as the principle of utility. Okay, so no one's gonna argue with a philosophy that tells them to seek pleasure. But sometimes doing what provides the most pleasure to the most people can mean that you have to take one for the team. It can mean sacrificing your pleasure in order to produce more good overall. Like when it's your birthday and your family says you can choose any restaurant you want. The thing that would make you happiest is Thai food, but you know that that would make the rest of your family miserable. So when you choose Chinese, which is nobody's favorite but everybody can make do, then you've thought like a utilitarian. You've chosen the action that would produce the most overall happiness for the group, even though it produced less happiness for you than other alternatives would have. The problem is, for the most part, we're all our own biggest fans. We each come preloaded with a bias in favor of our own interests. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Caring about yourself is a good way to promote survival. But where morality is concerned, utilitarians argue, as special as you are no more special than anybody else. So your interests count, but no more than anyone else's. Now, you might say you agree with that. I mean, we all like to think of ourselves as being generous and selfless. But even though I'm sure you are a totally nice person, you have to admit that things seem way more important, weightier, higher stakes when they apply to you rather than to some stranger. So utilitarians suggest that we make our moral decisions from the position of a benevolent, disinterested spectator. Rather than thinking about what I should do, they suggest that I consider what I would think if I were advising a group of strangers about what they should do. That way, I have a disposition of goodwill, but I'm not emotionally invested, and I'm a spectator rather than a participant. This approach is far more likely to yield a fair and unbiased judgment about what's really best for the group. Now, to see utilitarianism put to the test, let's pop over to the thought bubble for some flash philosophy. 20th century British philosopher Bernard Williams offered this thought experiment. Jim is on a botanical expedition in South America when he happens upon a group of 20 indigenous people and a group of soldiers. The whole group of indigenous people is about to be executed for protesting their oppressive regime. For some reason, the leader of the soldiers offers Jim the chance to shoot one of the prisoners since he's a guest in their land. He says that if Jim shoots one of the prisoners, he'll let the other 19 go. But if Jim refuses, then the soldiers will shoot all 20 protesters. What should Jim do? More importantly, what would you do? Williams actually presents this case as a critique of utilitarianism. The theory clearly demands that Jim shoot one man so that 19 will be saved, but Williams argues no moral theory ought to demand the taking of an innocent life. Thinking like a Kantian, Williams argues that it's not Jim's fault that the head soldier is a total dirtbag, and Jim shouldn't have to get literal blood on his hands to try and rectify the situation. So although it sounds pretty simple, utilitarianism is a really demanding moral theory. It says we live in a world where sometimes people do terrible things, and if we're the ones who happen to be there and we can do something to make things better, we must, even if that means getting our hands dirty. And if I sit by and watch something bad happen when I could have prevented it, my hands are dirty anyway. So Jim shouldn't think about it as killing one man. That man was dead already because they were all about to be killed. Instead, Jim should think of his decision as doing what it takes to save 19. And Batman needs to kill the Joker already. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, if you decide you want to follow utilitarian moral theory, you have options. Specifically, two of them. When Bentham and Mill first proposed their moral theory, it was in a form now known as act utilitarianism, sometimes called classical utilitarianism. And it says that in any given situation, you should choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number, period. But sometimes the act that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number can seem just wrong. For instance, suppose a surgeon has 5 patients all waiting for transplants. One needs a heart, another a lung, 2 are waiting for kidneys, and the last needs a liver. The doctor is pretty sure that these patients will all die before their names come up on the transplant list, and he just so happens to have a neighbor who has no family, total recluse, not even a very nice guy. The doctor knows that no one would miss the guy if he were to disappear, and by some miracle, the neighbor is a match for all 5 of the transplant patients. So it seems like, even though this would be a bad day for the neighbor, an act utilitarian should kill the neighbor and give his organs to the 5 patients. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. Yes, 1 innocent person dies, but 5 innocent people are saved. This might seem harsh, but remember that pain is pain regardless of who's experiencing it. So the death of the neighbor would be no worse than the death of any of those patients dying on the transplant list. In fact, it's 5 times less bad than all 5 of their deaths. So thought experiments like this one led some utilitarians to come up with another framework for their theory. This one is called rule utilitarianism. This version of the theory says that we ought to live by rules that, in general, are likely to lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. So yes, there are going to be situations where killing an innocent person will lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. But rule utilitarians want us to think long-term and on a larger scale. And overall, a whole society where innocent people are taken off the streets to be harvested for their organs is going to have a lot less utility than one where you don't have to live in constant fear of that happening to you. So rule utilitarianism allows us to refrain from acts that might maximize utility in the short run, and instead follow rules that will maximize utility for the majority of the time. As an owner of human organs, this approach might make sense to you. But I still gotta say, if Batman were a utilitarian of either kind, it wouldn't look very good for the Joker. Today, we learned about utilitarianism. We studied the principle of utility and learned about the difference between act and rule utilitarianism. Next time, we'll take a look at another moral theory, contractarianism. Crash Course Philosophy is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. You can head over to their channel and check out a playlist of the latest episodes from shows like The Good Stuff, Gross Science, and PBS Idea Channel. This episode of Crash Course was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio with the help of all of these awesome people, and our equally fantastic graphics team is Thought Cafe.
ethics, so I just wanted to go over a few things here and explain why I think everyone should be a negative utilitarian. There's three main branches of ethics. First, I'm going to talk about virtue ethics and duty ethics. So what comes to mind with virtue ethics is basically words like compassion, honesty, respect. And what comes to mind with duty ethics would be rules like don't murder, don't rape, wear a seatbelt, don't assault people. So the difference between these two is that one of them is telling you to be a good person, while the other one is telling you to do good things. But I'm not going to make a distinction here. Deontology contains virtue ethics in it. You can just make a rule that says, be virtuous. Now there is a problem with deontology. Imagine there's 5 people that are going to get hit by a train, and the only way to save them is by pushing some guy in front of the train. Is it ethical to push him?
Well,
according to deontology, you would be breaking a rule by murdering this person. According to virtue ethics, you wouldn't be all that compassionate if you were to push someone in front of a train. But somehow, we kind of know what the right answer to this question is. How about I change it a little bit? Imagine you had to kill one innocent pig to save 100 million pigs from being killed. Would you do it? Here's another example. Would you slap one child yourself or let 10 children get raped by other people? The answers to these questions are pretty obvious. So deontology doesn't work, but some people still think it does. Here's an example. This guy is a vegan, and he answered both of these questions wrong. The last branch in normative ethics is utilitarianism. It tells us that we need to try to minimize suffering and maximize pleasure. It completely solves the problem of our previous questions because it tells us to just look at the outcomes and decide what we want to do based on which outcome will lead to the least amount of suffering and the most amount of pleasure. It works pretty well, but then there's an issue. The issue here is with pleasure. Can you justify rape by saying that there's a lot of pleasure that is gained from the rape? Can you justify torturing someone if it makes 10 million people feel very happy? Well, according to utilitarianism, all you have to do is get enough pleasure, and then it'll make up for the suffering. Which is why there's a correction to utilitarianism. It's known as negative utilitarianism. It focuses on hard, unconsensual suffering. Just hard suffering might be somewhat of a problem, but the real issue is when it's unconsensual. For example, getting raped, losing a loved one, getting physically or emotionally harmed, and dying. And so according to negative utilitarianism, we really need to do our best to make sure that these things don't happen. They are never acceptable, even if they happen to only one person. It isn't acceptable. Even if there is a ton of pleasure that's gained from it, it's still not acceptable. As soon as there is unconsensual, hard suffering, we need to step back and agree that we're not okay with this. That's really the only way to do ethics. That's the reason why society agrees rape should be illegal and never justified. Slavery should be illegal and never justified. Assaulting someone should be illegal and never justified. And there's a few things that society simply hasn't caught up on yet. So here's a nice tree that simplifies everything. First we can look at metaphysics, an argument about whether theism is correct or atheism is correct. But this has nothing to do with ethics, so I'm just going to leave it aside for now. Next we can look at meta-ethics, but this is basically ridiculous. These people think that it's okay to be a serial killer if you feel like being one day, which is just bullshit. Then we look at deontology, which failed because of a huge logical inconsistency. And finally we can go to consequentialism, which starts making more sense, but utilitarianism makes rape justifiable, so it needs to be corrected. And so we are left with negative utilitarianism. So here are some implications of negative utilitarianism that society hasn't already agreed on. We shouldn't be causing unconsensual hard suffering to animals by eating animal product, because the pleasure we get out of the animal products doesn't make up for the unconsensual hard suffering that is experienced by the animals that are the victims. And finally, there's ethilism, the idea that we shouldn't be endorsing life. We shouldn't have children or create life in general, because that inevitably leads to hard unconsensual suffering. But what really makes you an ethicist is if you would be willing to press a red button that instantly kills all life on Earth. This would prevent a ton of unconsensual hard suffering from happening. So it should be easy for people to just agree with it. But people don't agree with it at all. They have a huge problem with it. And to understand their problem, we need to talk about the fear of death. Evolution programs you to be afraid of death, because it's crucial to a species' survival. But there's nothing really bad about death in isolation. There's nothing good about it, but there's also nothing bad about it. The unconsensual suffering that usually occurs before death might be a problem, but the death itself isn't an issue. Society already knows this and agrees with it. We put our pets to sleep when they are suffering, and some countries give humans the right to consent to dying by a lethal injection. This is just another issue that society needs to catch up on. People deserve the right to die. Now, I'm not saying anyone should commit suicide. If you're suffering and can't handle it anymore, then yes, you should be free to consent to dying. But negative utilitarians really need to stay here as long as they can, if we're ever going to get anything done, ethically speaking. I think negative utilitarianism will prevent a ton of people from committing suicide early in life. If we all agree that everyone's suffering has value and everyone's consent should be respected, we can start actually caring about each other. The world will be a lot more bearable if people stop treating each other like garbage. I think it's possible for rich males to stop doing ridiculous shit like building a 58-floor building just so they can put their name on it. It's also possible for females to stop making males feel so unloved that they need to do this crap to feel like their sexual partner actually cares about them. Women are complicit in the stupidity here, and if you're going to be rational, you're going to have to hold the position that there is no need for $200,000 cars. Once we actually start figuring this out, we could start spending our money and resources on actually making life better for everyone. Look, if you want a pretty car, you can just buy a regular car and some paint. So I do think everyone should be a negative utilitarian. The only reason they aren't is because society hasn't fully caught up with this idea that we can be real about ethics. I took an ethics class at UCLA, the #1 public university in America, and they didn't mention negative utilitarianism. They just told us that none of these frameworks are valid, and we have no idea what we're doing, ethically speaking. Well, we do know what we're doing. Negative utilitarianism is flawless. If anyone wants to have a debate with me or a discussion or a conversation, I'm okay with doing that on this channel. I'm also an atheist, and I'm okay with having discussions about religion as well. I don't see any good reason to be scared to talk about this stuff, and I'm not mad at anyone for disagreeing with me. Most of society disagrees with me. I just expect you to take it seriously because I take it very seriously. It's okay if you're not currently a vegan or if you've had kids. If you end up agreeing with me, you can just start attempting to go vegan and just not have any more kids. You should probably also make sure your children don't experience any unconsensual hard suffering, but most people already know that. You can come talk to us negative utilitarians in the Only Debates That Matter Discord. There's a link in the description of this video. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Really appreciate it.
So quit pretending you're some magical maggot. You're a shitty, little cruddy worm, alright? Puke, that's what you are.
Makes all the difference. Michelin wiper blades with exclusive SmartFlex technology hug your windshield like our tires hug the road for better visibility. See clearly, drive safely. The 18th century writer David Hume is one of the world's great philosophical voices because he hit upon a key fact about human nature: that we are more influenced by our feelings than by reason. This is, at one level, possibly a great insult to our self-image, but Hume thought that if we could learn to deal well with this surprising fact, we could be, both individually and collectively, a great deal calmer and happier than if we denied it. Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711 to a family that was long established but far from rich. He was the second son, and it was clear early on that he would need to find a job eventually. But nothing seemed to suit him. He tried law, the vocation of his father and older brother, but soon decided that it was a laborious profession, requiring the drudgery of a whole life. He was considered for academic posts at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow, but he didn't land either job. So he set out to become a public intellectual, someone who would make his money selling books to the general public. It was pretty hard going. His first book, A Treatise of Human Nature, for which he had the highest hopes, met with a dismal reception. Never literary attempt was more unfortunate than my treatise, he wrote. It fell dead-born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. But Hume kept at it, realizing that the blame largely lay with the way he expressed his ideas, and doggedly training himself to write in a more accessible and popular manner. Eventually, he did find an audience. His later works, popular history books and collections of elegant essays, were bestsellers of the day. As he would say, not without some pride, the money given me by booksellers much exceeded anything formerly known in England. I was to become not only independent, but opulent. Hume's philosophy is built around a single powerful observation, that the key thing we need to get right in life is feeling rather than rationality. It sounds like an odd conclusion. Normally we assume that what we need to do is train our minds to be as rational as possible, to be devoted to evidence and logical reasoning, and committed to preventing our feelings from getting in the way. But Hume insisted that whatever we may aim for, reason is the slave of passion. We are more motivated by our feelings than by any of the comparatively feeble results of analysis and logic. Few of our leading convictions are driven by rational investigations of the facts. We decide whether someone is admirable, what to do with our spare time, what constitutes a successful career, or love, on the basis of feeling above anything else. Reason helps a little, but the decisive factors are bound up with our emotional lives, with our passions, as Hume calls them. Hume lived in a time known as the Age of Reason, when many claimed that the glory of human beings consists in their rationality. But for Hume, a human is just another kind of animal. Hume was deeply attentive to the curious way that we very often reason from rather than to our convictions. We find an idea nice or threatening, and on that basis alone declare it true or false. Reason only comes in later to support the original attitude. What Hume didn't believe, however, was that all feelings are acceptable and equal. That's why he firmly believed in the education of the passions. People have to learn to be more benevolent, more patient, more at ease with themselves, and less afraid of others. But to be taught these things, they need an education system that addresses feelings rather than reason. This is why Hume so deeply believed in the role and significance of public intellectuals. These were people who, unlike university professors, who Hume grew to dislike immensely, had to excite a passion-based attachment to ideas, wisdom, and insight. Only if they succeeded would they have the money to do it. It was for this reason that to write well, use colourful examples, and have recourse to wit and charm. Hume's insight is that if you want to change people's beliefs, reasoning with them like a law or philosophy professor won't be the most effective strategy. He's pointing out that we have to try to impress sentiments by convincing with reassurance, good example, encouragement, and what he called art. And only later, for a few determined souls, will we ever try to make a case on the basis of facts and logic. A key place where Hume made use of the idea of the priority of feeling over reason was in connection with religion. Hume didn't think it was rational to believe in God. That is, he didn't think there were compelling, logical arguments in favor of the existence of a deity. He himself seems to have floated with a mild agnosticism that there might be a God, I'm just not sure. And mild theism is a God. It doesn't make much difference to me who there is. However, the idea of a vindictive God, someone ready to punish people in an afterlife for not believing in him in this one, this is a cruel superstition. Hume's central point is that religious belief isn't the product of reason, so arguing for or against it on the basis of facts doesn't touch the core issue. To try to persuade someone to believe or not believe with well-formed arguments seemed particularly daft to Hume. This is why he was a foremost defender of the concept of religious toleration. We shouldn't treat those who disagree with us in religion as rational people who've made an error of reasoning and so need to make it right, but rather as passionate, emotion-driven creatures who should be left in peace so long as they do likewise with us. Trying to have a rational argument with religion was for Hume the height of folly and arrogance. Hume was what is technically known as a skeptic, someone committed to doubting a lot of the common sense ideas of the day. One of the things he doubted was the concept of what is technically called personal identity, the idea that we have that we can understand ourselves and have a more or less graspable and enduring identity that runs through life. Hume pointed out that there is no such thing as a core self. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, he famously explained, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. Hume concluded that we aren't really the neat, definable people reason tells us that we are, and that we seem to be when we look at ourselves in the mirror or casually use that grand and rather misleading word, I. We are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Yet, despite being skeptical of temper, Hume was very happy for us to hold on to most of our common sense beliefs, because they are what help us to make our way in the world. Trying to be rational about everything is a special kind of madness. Hume was making a sly dig at Descartes. The French philosopher had died 60 years before Hume was born, but his intellectual influence was still very much alive. He had argued that we should throw out every fruit of the mind that wasn't perfectly rational. But Hume proposed that hardly anything we do is ever truly rational, and yet he ventured that most beliefs are justified simply because they work, they're useful to us, they help us to get on with what we want to do. The test of a belief isn't its provable truth, but its utility. Hume was offering a corrective, which we sometimes badly need, to our fascination with prestigious, but not actually very important logical conundrums. In opposition to academic niceties, he was a skeptical philosopher who stood for common sense, championing the everyday and the wisdom of the unlearned and the ordinary. Hume took a great interest in the traditional philosophical topic of ethics, the conundrum of how humans can be good. He argued that morality isn't about having moral ideas. It's about having been trained from an early age in the art of decency through the emotions. Being good means getting into good habits of feeling. Hume was a great advocate of qualities like wit, good manners, and sympathy, because these are the things that make people nice to be around, outside of any rational plan to be good. He was hugely struck by the fact that a person, and here again he was thinking of Descartes, can be ostensibly rational and yet not that nice, because being able to follow a complex argument or deduce trends from data doesn't make you sensitive to the sufferings of others or skilled at keeping your temper. These qualities are the work of our feelings. So if we want people to behave well, what we need to do is rethink education. We have to influence the development of feeling. We have to encourage benevolence, gentleness, pity, and shame through the seduction of the passionate sides of our nature, without delivering dry, logical lectures. Hume's philosophy always emerged as an attempt to answer a personal question. What is a good life? He wanted to know how his own character and that of those around him could be influenced for the best. And oddly, for a philosopher, he didn't feel that the traditional practice of philosophy could really help. Though he was scholarly, he was in large part a man of the world. For some years he was an advisor to the British ambassador in Paris, who welcomed his shrewd wisdom. He was much liked by those around him, known by the French as le bon David, a humane, kind, and witty conversationalist, much in demand as a dinner companion. Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man, he insisted. That's the way Hume lived, not in the intellectual seclusion of a monastery or an ivory tower, but deeply embedded in the company of other humans. Dining, he especially liked roast chicken, chatting about love and career, and playing backgammon. Hume died in Edinburgh in August 1776, at home in his house in St Andrew's Square. His doctor wrote about the last hours to Adam Smith, for many years Hume's best friend. He continued to the last perfectly sensible and free from much pain or feelings of distress. He never dropped the smallest expression of impatience, but when he had occasion to speak to the people around him, always did it with affection and tenderness. He died in such a happy composure of mind, nothing could exceed it. Hume remains that rather outstanding thing, a philosopher alive to how much philosophy has to learn from common sense. without any help from anyone else, all the knowledge that we may need for the conduct of life. Descartes had immense faith in what introspection, guided by definition, sound argument, and clarity of thought, could achieve. He believed that much of what was wrong with the world was caused by misusing our minds, by confusion, bad definition, and unconscious illogicality. His life was an attempt to make our minds better equipped for the task of thinking. To solve key questions, Descartes proposed that one always had to divide large problems into small, understandable sections by way of incisive questions. This is what he called his method of doubts. We get muddled by certain questions like, what's the meaning of life, or what is love, because we're not careful enough about how we break these big inquiries down. He described the method of doubts as akin to having a large barrel of apples, where good ones are mixed with bad ones. To be a philosopher means a commitment to sorting out the entire barrel, to inspecting each apple individually and throwing away all the bad ones to ensure only those of the best quality are left. Another way to think about Descartes, and this explains why he would, among other things, turn out to be such a hero to the leaders of the French Revolution, is that he believed in grounding all of our ideas in individual experience and reason, rather than authority and tradition. In his greatest book, Discourse on the Method, published in 1637, he explained how he'd come to write it. A long time ago, I entirely abandoned the study of letters, resolving to seek no knowledge other than that which could be found in myself, or else in the great book of the world. I spent my youth travelling, visiting courts and armies, mixing with people of diverse temperaments and ranks, gathering various experiences, testing myself in situations which fortune afforded me, and at all times reflecting personally upon whatever came my way, so as to derive some profit from it. Descartes spent a large part of his adult life away from his native France in the Dutch Republic, since he held the belief, not entirely unwisely, that the mercantile Dutch would, as a people, be far too concerned with earning money to pester a free-thinking man like himself. However, it turned out that the Dutch were a little less materialistic than he'd hoped, and the philosopher ended up moving 24 times to keep ahead of spies and government agents. Descartes' subjective approach to philosophy reached its climax when he arrived at the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The phrase first appeared in French, je pense, donc je suis, in the Discourse on the Method, before then appearing in Latin in the Principles of Philosophy of 1644. It was intended to be Descartes' ultimate answer to a question that philosophers sometimes get perhaps unreasonably interested in, namely, how can one know that anything, including oneself, actually exists, rather than being some sort of dream or phantasm? On his quest for certainty around this question of whether it might all be a dream, Descartes began by observing that our human senses are deeply unreliable. He couldn't, for example, he said, be trusted to know whether he was actually sitting in a room in his dressing gown next to a fire, or merely dreaming of such a thing. But there was one thing he could know for sure. He could trust that he was actually thinking. His existence could be proved by a neat tautological trick. He could not be thinking and wondering if he existed if he did not exist. Therefore, his thinking was a very basic proof of his being. Or, to return to the maxim, I think, therefore I am. This might not sound like a huge insight, but Descartes used it as an Archimedean point in an epistemologically unsteady world. With this certainty safely backed, Descartes argued that his mind could go on to discover other, similarly irrefutable truths. Some of the charm of Descartes' work comes through his entwining of personal details, along with more arid philosophical passages. He tells us, for example, that his revolutionary idea came to him during the winter of 1619, when he'd escaped the fierce cold of the Low Countries by hopping into a stove and spending the whole day meditating inside. Descartes epitomizes the solitary end of philosophy. One can, in his eyes, solve the most profound problems by searching deep within oneself. Teams of individuals or ideas passed through generations, as they are in universities, are deeply suspect for Descartes. Philosophers don't need gangs of scientists using expensive equipment, unheard of terminology, and huge data sets. They just need a quiet room and a rational mind. At another point, Descartes recounts that he mocked friends of his who once showed up at his home at 11 in the morning and were surprised to find him still in bed. What are you doing? They inquired skeptically. Thinking, Descartes replied. The group was stunned, but Descartes criticized them in turn for privileging often nonsensical practical tasks over the beauty of pure, quiet reflection therefore opened the passions of the soul with a characteristic claim. I shall be obliged to write just as if I were considering a topic that no one had dealt with before me. The work provides a beautiful taxonomy of pretty much any passion one might feel, as well as descriptions of their causes, effects, and functions. This is followed by another section called The Discipline of Virtue, a manual of advice on how we can control our passions and enjoy a virtuous life. Descartes identified 6 fundamental passions: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. From these, there followed in his eyes an unlimited number of specific passions, combinations of the original ones. Descartes didn't believe in vanquishing passions, as the ancient Stoic philosophers had proposed, merely in learning how to identify them in oneself and understand their impact on one's behavior. He would have been very sympathetic to psychotherapy. He believed that a key task of being a philosopher was to help people understand and therefore control their passions, that is, become a little less anxious, status-driven, scared, or inclined to fall head over heels in love with inappropriate people. He was optimistic about how much progress we could make psychologically. Even those who have the weakest souls can acquire absolute mastery over their passions if they work hard enough at training and guiding them. Descartes' psychological and philosophical work attracted ever more powerful admirers. In 1646, Queen Christina of Sweden got interested in sorting out issues in her mind and began a correspondence with Descartes. She even persuaded the philosopher to move to Sweden to tutor her in passion and philosophy in 1649. However, the early working hours required, the Queen could only make time for lessons at 5 a.m., and the harsh cold soon made Descartes ill. He died of pneumonia in 1650 at the age of 53. To remember Descartes by "I think, therefore I am" is perhaps not as shallow as one might initially have presumed. The sentence does truly capture something important about him and the task of philosophy in general. Working through emotional confusion, prejudice, and unhelpful tradition in order to arrive at an independent, rationally founded vision of existence.
Plato. The context of Plato. If you look at a map of Europe, you will observe that Greece is a skeleton-like hand stretching its crooked fingers out into the Mediterranean Sea. South of it lies the great island of Crete, from which those grasping fingers captured in the 2nd millennium before Christ the beginnings of civilization and culture. To the east, across the Aegean Sea, lies Asia Minor, quiet and apathetic now, but throbbing in pre-Platonic days with industry, commerce, and speculation. To the west, across the Ionian, Italy stands like a leaning tower in the sea, and Sicily and Spain, each in those days with thriving Greek colonies, and at the end, the Pillars of Hercules, which we call Gibraltar, that somber portal through which not many an ancient mariner dared to pass. And on the north, those still untamed and half-barbaric regions, then named Thessaly and Epirus and Macedonia, from which or through which the vigorous bands had come which fathered the geniuses of Homeric and Periclean Greece. Look again at the map, and you see countless indentations of coast and elevations of land, everywhere gulfs and bays and the intrusive sea, and all the earth tumbled and tossed into mountains and hills. Greece was broken into isolated fragments by these natural barriers of sea and soil. Travel and communication were far more difficult and dangerous then than now. Every valley, therefore, developed its own self-sufficient economic life, its own sovereign government, its own institutions and dialect and religion and culture. In each case, 1 or 2 cities, and around them, stretching up the mountain slopes, an agricultural hinterland. Such were the city-states of Euboea, and Locris, and Aetolia, and Phocis, and Boeotia, and Achaea, and Argolis, and Elis, and Arcadia, and Messenia, and Laconia, with its Sparta, and Attica, with its Athens. Look at the map a last time, and observe the position of Athens. It is the far farthest east of the larger cities of Greece. It was favorably placed to be the door through which the Greeks passed out to the busy cities of Asia Minor, and through which those elder cities sent their luxuries and their culture to adolescent Greece. It had an admirable port, Piraeus, where countless vessels might find a haven from the rough waters of the sea. And it had a great maritime fleet. In 490 to 470 BC, Sparta and Athens, forgetting their jealousies and joining their forces, fought off the effort of the Persians under Darius and Xerxes to turn Greece into a colony of an Asiatic empire. In this struggle of youthful Europe against the senile East, Sparta provided the army and Athens the navy. The war over, Sparta demobilized her troops and suffered the economic disturbances natural to that process, while Athens turned her navy into a merchant fleet and became one of the greatest trading cities of the ancient world. Sparta relapsed into agricultural seclusion and stagnation, while Athens became a busy mart and port, the meeting place of many races of men and of diverse cults and customs, whose contact and rivalry begot comparison, analysis, and thought. Traditions and dogmas rub one another down to a minimum in such centers of varied intercourse. Where there are 1,000 faiths, we are apt to become skeptical of them all. Probably the traders were the first skeptics. They had seen too much to believe too much, and the general disposition of merchants to classify all men as either fools or knaves inclined them to question every creed. Gradually, too, they were developing science. Mathematics grew with the increasing complexity of exchange, astronomy with the increasing audacity of navigation. The growth of wealth brought the leisure and security which are the prerequisite of research and speculation. Men now ask the stars not only for guidance on the seas, but as well for an answer to the riddles of the universe. The first Greek philosophers were astronomers. Proud of their achievements, says Aristotle, men pushed farther afield after the Persian Wars. They took all knowledge for their province and sought ever wider studies. Men grew bold enough to attempt natural explanations of processes and events before attributed to supernatural agencies and powers. Magic and ritual slowly gave way to science and control, and philosophy began. At first, this philosophy was physical. It looked out upon the material world and asked what was the final and irreducible constituent of things. The natural termination of this line of thought was the materialism of Democritus, 460 to 360 BC. In reality, there is nothing but atoms and space. This was one of the main streams of Greek speculation. It passed underground for a time in Plato's day, but emerged in Epicurus, 342 to 270, and became a torrent of eloquence in Lucretius, 98 to 55 BC. But the most characteristic and fertile developments of Greek philosophy took form with the sophists, traveling teachers of wisdom, who looked within upon their own thought and nature rather than out upon the world of things. They were all clever men, Gorgias and Hippias, for example, and many of them were profound, Protagoras, Prodicus. There is hardly a problem or a solution in our current philosophy of mind and conduct which they did not realize and discuss. They asked questions about anything. They stood unafraid in the presence of religious or political taboos, and boldly subpoenaed every creed and institution to appear before the judgment seat of reason. In politics, they divided into two schools. One, like Rousseau, argued that nature is good and civilization bad, that by nature all men are equal, becoming unequal only by class-made institutions, and that law is an invention of the strong to chain and rule the weak. Another school, like Nietzsche, claimed that nature is beyond good and evil, that by nature all men are unequal, that morality is an invention of the weak to limit and deter the strong, that power is the supreme virtue and the supreme desire of man, and that of all forms of government the wisest and most natural is aristocracy.
Trying to figure out how to tan this hide. I don't know how to do it. DayZ tan pelt.
Down. You can skin the animal using any type of knife, and after you've done that, you're going to be left with some pelt and a hell of a lot of steaks. Okay,
I just killed a cow with an axe. He was laying down on the ground, and I just snuck up to him and hit him with an axe. I don't even have any bullets. I have a gun, but I don't have any bullets for the gun that I have anyway.
Oh shit, he's down. He's down. He's down. Wait, no, he's not. Got him. Got him. Got him. 7. Holy fuck, man.
Guys are fucking slaughtering cows and I'm chasing the fucking
That's the
chicken
biggest
over
cow
here.
slaughter I've ever seen in my life.
Holy shit.
Trey just killed like 4. I think I got 2. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 dead cows. Okay, maybe that was a little bit of an overkill, but
Yeah, you guys can't carry all that.
Cheers. So you need a barrel with no holes in it, with a little bit of water in it,
Oh.
a bag of lime, and you put your pelts in there, close the lid, and hit 10 pelts. I didn't have enough water in here, so I had to add a cooking pot full of water, and then it worked after. The tanning
Well, never mind
process
all
takes
that.
approximately 3 minutes. Go back to my barrel, and this bag of lime has done 7, 14, 18 pelts. But now it's badly damaged, so I can't use it. So you got about 18 pelts out of 1 bag of lime. So it's good to have a couple extra bags on hand. So I'm going to repeat the process, and now we'll get to making some stuff. Okay, so here I've got some leather kits. I'm going to take them because you need them to make the sew your stuff together. I'm going to go over to my barrel where I've got leather cap. Doesn't have to be in the barrel, it could be in the tin. And I've made a whole bunch of leather, as you can see. I'm going to take my leather kit in my hand, I'm going to drag it to there, and I'm going to be able to choose what I can make here. So there I've just made the vest, which has 9 slots in it.
Oh, so you can make your own clothes.
Jacket. But I don't have this leather kit's too badly damaged.
This is on computer though, so I assume it's the same on
So
PS4.
I
I
come
don't
back
know.
with my brand new leather kit, and I make some new stuff here. I'm gonna make the leather sack, and that didn't show up in my inventory because it's too big. It's probably outside the barrel. So you can see there's quite a number of slots here. It's a pretty decent, durable backpack. I'm just gonna put it in there for the time. Let's see here. Let's go for the leather jacket. There it is there. That in there. That in there, because I'm gonna dye them afterwards. I'll show you how to dye it. I'm just conglomerating leather here.
I'm not gonna worry about that right now. I don't know. I'd have to find lime and a barrel and a bunch of water. That'd be something you'd need like a clan to do almost, or a private server.
Supreme virtue and the supreme desire of man, and that of all forms of government, the wisest and most natural is aristocracy. No doubt this attack on democracy reflected the rise of a wealthy minority at Athens which called itself the Oligarchical Party, and denounced democracy as an incompetent sham. In a sense, there was not much democracy to denounce, for of the 400,000 inhabitants of Athens, 250,000 were slaves, without political rights of any kind. And of the 150,000
God, just a
freemen or
retarded amount
citizens,
of
only a
food.
small number presented themselves at the Ecclesia, or General Assembly, where the policies of the state were discussed and determined. Yet what democracy they had was as thorough as never since. The General Assembly was the supreme power, and the highest official body, the Dicasteria or Supreme Court, consisted of over 1,000 members, to make bribery expensive, selected by alphabetical rote from the roll of all the citizens. No institution could have been more democratic, nor, said its opponents, more absurd. During the great generation-long Peloponnesian War, 430 to 400 BC, in which the military power of Sparta fought and at last defeated the naval power of Athens, the Athenian Oligarchic Party, led by Critias, advocated the abandonment of democracy on the score of its inefficiency in war, and secretly lauded the aristocratic government of Sparta. Many of the oligarchic leaders were exiled, but when at last Athens surrendered, one of the peace conditions imposed by Sparta was the recall of these exiled aristocrats. They had hardly returned when, with Critias at their head, They declared a rich man's revolution against the Democratic Party that had ruled during the disastrous war. The revolution failed, and Critias was killed on the field of battle. Now, Critias was a pupil of Socrates and an uncle of Plato. Socrates. If we may judge from the bust that has come down to us as part of the ruins of ancient sculpture, Socrates was as far from being handsome as even a philosopher can be. A bald head, a great round face, deep-set staring eyes, a broad and flowery nose that gave vivid testimony to many a symposium. It was rather the head of a porter than that of the most famous of philosophers. But if we look again, we see, through the crudity of the stone, something of that human kindliness and unassuming simplicity
So
which
fat's
made this
only
homely
food,
thinker a teacher beloved
I
of
was
the
hoping it
finest
would be food
youths in
and water.
Athens. We know so little about him, and yet we know him so much more intimately than the aristocratic Plato or the reserved and scholarly Aristotle. Across 2,300 years, we can yet see his ungainly figure, clad always in the same rumpled tunic, walking leisurely through the agora, undisturbed by the bedlam of politics, buttonholing his prey, gathering the young and the learned about him, luring them into some shady nook of the temple porticos, and asking them to define their terms. They were a motley crowd, these youths who flocked about him and helped him to create European philosophy. There were rich young men like Plato and Alcibiades, who relished his satirical analysis of Athenian democracy. There were socialists like Antisthenes, who liked the master's careless poverty and made a religion of it. There was even an anarchist or two among them, like Aristippus, who aspired to a world in which there would be neither masters nor slaves, and all would be as worrylessly free as Socrates. All the problems that agitate human society today and provide the material of youth's endless debate agitated as well that little band of thinkers and talkers who felt, with their teacher, that life without discourse would be unworthy of a man. Every school of social thought had there its representative, and perhaps its origin. How the master lived hardly anybody knew. He never worked, and he took no thought of the morrow. He ate when his disciples asked him to honor their tables. They must have liked his company, for he gave every indication of physiological prosperity. He was not so welcome at home, for he neglected his wife and children. And from Xanthippes' point of view, he was a good-for-nothing idler who brought to his family more notoriety than bread. Xanthippe liked to talk almost as much as Socrates did, and they seem to have had some dialogues which Plato failed to record. Yet she, too, loved him, and could not contentedly see him die even after 80 years and 10. Why did his pupils reverence him so? Perhaps because he was a man as well as a philosopher. He had, at great risk, saved the life of Alcibiades in battle, and he could drink like a gentleman, without fear and without excess. But no doubt they liked best in him the modesty of his wisdom. He did not claim to have wisdom, but only to seek it lovingly. He was wisdom's amateur, not its professional. It was said that the oracle at Delphi, with unusual good sense, had pronounced him the wisest of the Greeks, and he had interpreted this as an approval of the agnosticism which was the starting point of his philosophy. One thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing. Philosophy begins when one learns to doubt, particularly to doubt one's cherished beliefs, one's dogmas, and one's axioms. Who knows how these cherished beliefs became certainties with us, and whether some secret wish did not furtively beget them, clothing desire in the dress of thought. There is no real philosophy until the mind turns round and examines itself. Gnothe se auton, said Socrates, know thyself. There had been philosophers before him, of course, strong men like Thales and Heraclitus, subtle men like Parmenides and Zeno of Elea, seers like Pythagoras and Empedocles. But for the most part they had been physical philosophers. They had sought for the physis, or nature of external things, the laws and constituents of the material and measurable world. That is very good, said Socrates, but there is an infinitely worthier subject for philosophers than all these trees and stones, and even all those stars. There is the mind of man. What is man? and what can he become? So he went about prying into the human soul, uncovering assumptions and questioning certainties. If men discoursed too readily of justice, he asked them quietly, "Toti, what is it? What do you mean by these abstract words with which you so easily settle the problems of life and death? What do you mean by honor, virtue, morality, patriotism? What do you mean by yourself?" It was with such moral and psychological questions that Socrates loved to deal. Some who suffered from this Socratic method, this demand for accurate definitions and clear thinking and exact analysis, objected that he asked more than he answered, and left men's minds more confused than before. Nevertheless, he bequeathed to philosophy two very definite answers to two of our most difficult problems. What is the meaning of virtue, and what is the best state? No topics could have been more vital than these to the young Athenians of that generation. The sophists had destroyed the faith these youths had once had in the gods and goddesses of Olympus, and in the moral code that had taken its sanction so largely from the fear men had for these ubiquitous and innumerable deities. Apparently there was no reason now why a man should not do as he pleased, so long as he remained within the law. A disintegrating individualism had weakened the Athenian character and left the city a prey at last to the sternly nurtured Spartans. And as for the state, what could have been more ridiculous than this mob-led, passion-ridden democracy, this government by a debating society, this precipitate selection and dismissal and execution of generals, this unchoice choice of simple farmers and tradesmen in alphabetical rotation as members of the Supreme Court of the land? How could a new and natural morality be developed in Athens, and how could the state be saved? It was his reply to these questions that gave Socrates death and immortality. The older citizens would have honored him had he tried to restore the ancient polytheistic faith, if he had led his band of emancipated souls to the temples and the sacred groves, and bade them sacrifice again to the gods of their fathers. But he felt that that was a hopeless and suicidal policy, a progress backward, into and not over the tombs. He had his own religious faith. He believed in one God and hoped in his modest way that death would not quite destroy him. But he knew that a lasting moral code could not be based upon so uncertain a theology. If one could build a system of morality absolutely independent of religious doctrine, as valid for the atheist as for the pietist, then theologies might come and go without loosening the moral cement that makes of willful individuals the peaceful citizens of a community. If, for example, good meant intelligent and virtue meant wisdom, if men could be taught to see clearly their real interests, to see afar the distant results of their deeds, to criticize and coordinate their desires out of a self-canceling chaos into a purposive and creative harmony, this perhaps would provide for the educated and sophisticated man the morality which in the unlettered relies on reiterated precepts and external control. Perhaps all sin is error, partial vision, foolishness. The intelligent man may have the same violent and unsocial impulses as the ignorant man, but surely he will control them better and slip less often into imitation of the beast. And in an intelligently administered society, one that returned to the individual in widened powers more than it took from him in restricted liberty, the advantage of every man would lie in social and loyal conduct, and only clear sight would be needed to ensure peace and order and goodwill. But if the government itself is a chaos and an absurdity, if it rules without helping and commands without leading, how can we persuade the individual in such a state to obey the laws and confine his self-seeking within the circle of the total good? No wonder an Alcibiades turns against a state that distrusts ability and reverences number more than knowledge. No wonder there is chaos where there is no thought, and the crowd decides in haste and ignorance to repent at leisure and in desolation. Is it not a base superstition that mere numbers will give wisdom? On the contrary, is it not universally seen that men in crowds are more foolish and more violent and more cruel than men separate and alone? Is it not shameful that men should be ruled by orators who go ringing on in long harangues like brazen pots, which, when struck, continue to sound until a hand is put upon them? Plato's Protagoras. Surely the management of a the state is a matter for which men cannot be too intelligent, a matter that needs the unhindered thought of the finest minds. How can a society be saved or be strong except it be led by its wisest men? Imagine the reaction of the popular party at Athens to this aristocratic gospel at a time when war seemed to require the silencing of all criticism, and when the wealthy and lettered minority were plotting a revolution. Consider the feelings of Anytus, the democratic leader whose son had become a pupil of Socrates, and had then turned against the gods of his father and laughed in his father's face. Had not Aristophanes predicted precisely such a result from this specious replacement of the old virtues by unsocial intelligence? In The Clouds, 423 BC, Aristophanes had made great fun of Socrates and his thinking shop, where one learned the art of proving oneself right, however wrong. Pheidippides beats his father on the ground that his father used to beat him, and every debt should be repaid. The satire seems to have been good-natured enough. We find Aristophanes frequently in the company of Socrates. They agreed in their scorn of democracy, and Plato recommended The Clouds to Dionysius. As the play was brought out 24 years before the trial of Socrates, it could have had no great share in bringing the tragic denouement of the philosopher's life. Then the revolution came, and men fought for it and against, bitterly and to the death. When the democracy won, the fate of Socrates was decided. He was the intellectual leader of the revolting party, however pacific he might himself have been. He was the source of the hated aristocratic philosophy. He was the corrupter of youths, drunk with debate. It would be better, said Anytus and Meletus, that Socrates should die. The rest of the story all the world knows, for Plato wrote it down in prose more beautiful than poetry. We are privileged to read for ourselves that simple and courageous, if not legendary, apology or defense, in which the first martyr of philosophy proclaimed the rights and necessity of free thought, upheld his value to the state, and refused to beg for mercy from the crowd whom he had always contemned. They had the power to pardon him. He disdained to make the appeal. It was a singular confirmation of his theories that the judges should wish to let him go while the angry crowd voted for his death. Had he not denied the gods? Woe to him who teaches men faster than they can learn. So they decreed that he should drink the hemlock. His friends came to his prison and offered him an easy escape. They had bribed all the officials who stood between him and liberty. He refused. He was 70 years old now, 399 BC. Perhaps he thought it was time for him to die, and that he could never again die so usefully. Be of good cheer, he told his sorrowing friends, and say that you are burying my body only. When he had spoken these words, says Plato, in one of the great passages of the world's literature, he rose and went into the bath chamber with Crito, who bade us wait. And we waited, talking and thinking of the greatness of our sorrow. He was like a father of whom we were being bereaved, and we were about to pass the rest of our lives as orphans. Now the hour of sunset was near, for a good deal of time had passed while he was within. When he came out, he sat down with us again, but not much was said. Soon the jailer entered and stood by him, saying, "To you, Socrates, whom I know to be the noblest and gentlest and best of all who ever came to this place, I will not impute the angry feelings of other men who rage and swear at me when, in obedience to the authorities, I bid them drink the poison. Indeed, I am sure that you will not be angry with me, for others, as you are aware, and not I, are the guilty cause. And so fare you well, and try to bear lightly what must needs be. You know my errand." Then, bursting into tears, he turned away and went out. Socrates looked at him and said, "I return your good wishes, and will do as you bid." Then, turning to us, he said, "How charming the man is! Since I have been in prison, he has always been coming to see me, and now see how generously he sorrows for me. But we must do as he says, Crito. Let the cup be brought, if the poison is prepared. If not, let the attendant prepare some." "Yet," said Crito, "the sun is still upon the hilltops, and many a one has taken the draught late. And after the announcement has been made to him, he has eaten and drunk, and indulged in sensual delights. Do not hasten, then, there is still time." Socrates said, "Yes, Crito, and they of whom you speak are right in doing thus, for they think that they will gain by the delay. But I am right in not doing thus, for I do not think that I should gain anything by drinking the poison a little later. I should be sparing and saving a life which is already gone. I could only laugh at myself for this. Please then to do as I say, and not to refuse me.